Recently we collaborated with a local architect legend to design and make a frame for a concept house. The frame had been sitting outside for a couple of weeks, covered with a plastic film. To move the project further, the architect Uģis Šēnbergs and I decided to showcase the concept house at a local entrepreneur event and art exhibition. However, to do so, we have to make the house frame presentable and functional. We had this idea to make a square-shaped hammock that would create a large surface in the middle of the frame and add a custom-made tent inside the frame. The tent would protect you from the elements while sleeping on the giant hammock. Before sending the frame's 3D model and our requirements to the seamstress, I double-checked the frame's dimensions, and that uncovered some unpleasant surprises. The frame had got wet and some plywood components had turned grayish. And even though I had covered the frame with a plastic film, there were places where water had collected inside the frame. It wasn't good news. The frame didn't look presentable and we didn't have much time to fix that. The easiest solution would be to paint the whole frame with dark paint, hiding all the imperfections. But the paint would also cover the plywood surfaces that Uģis and I wanted to keep exposed. After a morning spent thinking, I decided the best solution would be to apply outdoor lacquer to the frame. That would require sanding all of the grayish wood and drying all the components. Since the weather forecast didn't look promising for the upcoming days, I decided to take the house frame apart and dry the parts in the workshop. Taking apart the build was surprisingly quick. First, I removed the corner panels inside the frame and then the small corner caps outside the frame. Then I took apart each side one by one. While doing so, I was trying to figure out why the plywood had turned gray. I remember picking the plywood suitable for exterior builds, and the salesman ensured the plywood would be good for outdoor use. Perhaps the salesman was referring to the glue used to make the plywood. The plywood for interior use probably would have started to delaminate after a couple of weeks outdoors, but I still haven't figured out why the wood was changing its colors that much. Anyway, I had disassembled the frame and it was time to spread the parts around the shop for drying. A couple of days later, I took the orbital sander and started to work on the components. My biggest concern was whether I would be able to remove the gray wood, and thankfully it wasn't that difficult. After a couple of passes with the sander, the gray shade had vanished, and the plywood surfaces had this vintage look. I liked it. While sanding the parts, I started to receive updates from the seamstress on the tent's progress. Since this was my first project involving a sewing machine, I didn't know what to expect, and I wasn't entirely sure how well the tent would fit, if it would at all. But it was nice to know that the work was moving forward on that front as well. At this point I had sanded all of the plywood surfaces except the edges. To do so, I clamped multiple parts together and gave it a couple of passes with a disc sander. I decided to skip the sanding on the cutout edges. I had the idea to cover them with white paint. It may be confusing now, but I promise it will make sense later. Anyway, I painted all the cutout edges white. For the frame's inside reinforcements, the corner components, the corner cover parts and the side components. It took quite some time to do, but it was essential to seal the plywood edges. The worst part of painting the edges white was the fact that I had to resand all of the larger surfaces to remove any paint that had spilled over. I probably should have painted the edges before I started sanding the components. This way I would have saved considerable time. Before applying the lacquer to all of the parts, I had to make a couple of paint drying racks. You can watch a separate video on that. Anyway, I started applying the finish to the frame components. First I applied the lacquer to components' sides and then to one of the larger surfaces. It allowed me to place the parts on the rack for drying. To make the process more efficient, I applied the finish to multiple parts at the same go, and soon I had filled both of the racks. Since I used a water-based finish, the components I had worked on first felt dry enough for me to finish them from the other side as well. And quite quickly I went through the first set of components and started finishing the side components. I wanted to seal the dovetail joint edges as well. It slowed down the finishing a bit. Right around this point I was wondering where could we place a spray booth in our tiny workshop. If we had one, finishing component edges would be much faster, but now I had to work what I had: a workbench, paint roller and a strict deadline. After around 10 hours of finishing, the parts were complete, and the next day I spent reassembling the frame. It went considerably faster than the first time. Now I knew exactly what I should do and in what order to install the parts. The fact that the frame was more weather resistant was fantastic, and I loved how the white component edges looked. The day before the local entrepreneur event, we received the tent and the hammock from the seamstress, and I was anxious to fit it into the frame. Since we had taken apart the frame while the seamstress was working on the tent, there was no way to test fit the tent while she was making it. So the chances of it fitting was 50-50. Not the best odds considering we had to present the urban dice in around 16 hours. But I tied the tent to the frame one edge at a time, and everything seemed to be working fine, and the tent looked fantastic. The white zippers and the white color thread matched with the cutout edges we painted earlier. The most enjoyable task was fitting the hammock between the corners. The next big challenge was getting the project to the event's location. At first Uģis and I were considering rolling it to the location of the event, but soon we realized it might take half of the day. So in the end we settled on the idea of putting the frame on the trailer and driving it to the event. To avoid any traffic, we decided to do the drive early in the morning, and the drive was an adventure in itself. After showcasing the urban dice in the first event, we had to take it to the exhibition hall. This time we had to do the drive during the traffic hours, so we removed the tent. It allowed us to drive faster. We left the urban dice at the front of the museum where the exhibition took place, so at the opening it was the first art piece visitors saw when attending the event. It attracted quite a lot of attention, especially when we were rolling it around. It was a great feeling to step inside the urban dice and remember how we went from a single photo to an art piece displayed in an art exhibition. I'm glad I had the honor to work with an architect and great personality, Uģis Šēnbergs, and I'm grateful to you for joining us on this crazy journey. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.